and flowering plants. Of the rare floral specimens and perishable tints, my mother made pencil and watercolor studies, having in view the book she was preparing for publication. On ascending the bluff overlooking the Big Blue, early on the afternoon of the 26th of May, we found the river booming and the water still rising. Driftwood and good-sized logs were floating by on a current so strong that all hope of fording it vanished even before its depth was measured. We encamped on the slope of the prairie, near a timber of cottonwood, oak, beech, and sycamore trees, where a clear brook rushed over its stony bed to join the Big Blue. Captain Russell, with my father and other sub-leaders, examined the river banks for marks of a ford. By sunset the river had risen 20 inches, and the water at the ford was 200 yards in width. A general meeting was caused to discuss the situation. Many insisted that the company, being comfortably settled, should wait until the waters receded, but the majority, agreeing with the captain, voted to construct a raft suitable to carry everything except the livestock, which could be forced to swim. The assembly was also called upon to settle a difference between two members of our Oregon contingent, friendly intervention having induced the disputants to suspend hostilities until their rights should be thus determined. The assembly, however, instead of passing upon the matter, appointed a committee to devise a way out of the difficulty. J.Q. Thornton's work, Oregon in California, has this reference to that committee, whose work was significant as developed by later events. Ex-Governor Boggs, Mr. James F. Reed, Mr. George Donner, and others, myself included, convened in a tent according to appointment of a General Assembly of the Immigrants, with the design of preparing a system of laws for the purpose of preserving order, etc. We proposed a few laws without, however, believing that they would possess much authority. Provision was made for the appointment of a court of arbitrators to hear and decide disputes, and to try offenders against the peace and good order of the company. The fiercest thunderstorm that we had yet experienced raged throughout that night, and had we not been protected by the bluff on one side and the timber on the other, our tents would have been carried away by the gale. The Big Blue had become so turbulent that work on the prospective craft was postponed, and our people proceeded to make the most of the unexpected holiday. Messrs. Grayson and Branham found a bee tree and brought several buckets of delicious honey into camp. Mr. Bryant gathered a quantity of wild peas and distributed them among the friends who had spices to turn them into sweet pickles. The evening was devoted to friendly intercourse, and the camp was merry with song and melodies dear to loved ones around the old hearthstones. Meanwhile, Captain Russell had drawn a plan of the craft that should be built, and had marked the cottonwood trees on the river bank, half a mile above camp, that would furnish the necessary materials. Bright and early the following morning, volunteer boat builders went to work with a will, and by the close of day had felled 2 trees about 3½ feet in diameter, had hollowed out the trunks, and made of them a pair of canoes 25 feet in length. In addition to this, they had also prepared timbers for the frames to hold them parallel and ensure the wagon wheels a steady place while being ferried across the river. The workers were well satisfied with their accomplishment. There was, however, sorrow instead of rejoicing in camp, for Mrs. Reed's aged mother, who had been failing for some days, died that night. At 2 o'clock the next afternoon, she was buried at the foot of a monarch oak, in a neat cottonwood coffin made by men of the party, and her grave was marked by a headstone. The craft being finished on the morning of the 30th of May was christened Blue Rover, and launched amid cheers of the company. Though not a thing of beauty, she was destined to fulfill the expectations of our worthy captain. One set of guide ropes held her in place at the point of embarkation, while swimmers on horseback carried another set of ropes across the river and quickly made them fast. Only one wagon at a time could cross, and great difficulty was experienced in getting the vehicles on and off the boat. Those working near the bank stood in water up to their armpits, and frequently were in grave peril. By the time the ninth wagon was safely landed, darkness fell. The only unforeseen delay that had occurred was occasioned by an awkward slip of the third wagon while being landed. The Blue Rover groaned under the shock, leaned to one side, and swamped one of the canoes. However, the damage was slight and easily repaired. The next day was Sunday, but the work had to go on, and the Reverend Mr. Cornwall was as ready for it as the rest of the toilers. Much anxiety was experienced when the cattle were forced into the water, and they had a desperate struggle in crossing the current, but they finally reached the opposite bank without accident. Each family embarked in its own wagon, and the last was ferried over in the rain at 9 o'clock that night. The ropes were then detached from the Blue Rover, and she drifted away in the darkness. Captain Russell had dispatched matters vigorously and tactfully, and when the labors of that day were completed, still had a word of cheer for the shivering, hungry travelers, whom he led into camp 1 mile west of the memorable Big Blue. Despite stiff joints and severe colds, all were anxious to resume travel at the usual hour next day, June the 1st. End of Chapter 2.